So yesterday we looked at how we could use a model to share data between two different views. So in this application we have a table view on the left, and then we have a form view on the right. And to share the data between them, we use a model and we just inject it into those two views. We also introduce scopes, and today I'd like to show you how you can transfer this model data or your view state data inside of that scope. So let's have a look at our person model. This is the one that we inject. So instead of just injecting it, we're going to create a custom scope, and we're going to call this scope person scope. It'll extend scope, and inside of it there will be a model of type person model. We'll actually instantiate it like this. Now that should take care of the person model, so we can transfer the person model together with the scope. But what we did yesterday was also share some state using a controller. So the person list was part of the controller, and we also added some data to it once the controller was initialized. So let's take this list of persons and go back to the person scope and inject that in here as well. And let's bring the test data along also. I can do this a bit differently this time, just by adding it right here. Right, so this scope now contains the selected person and also the list of persons. So how can we use that? Let's have a look at the person editor first. So let's assume that instead of this model, we will get this model from the scope, and the scope can now be cast to a person scope, because we will make sure that the scope for a person editor will always be a person scope. So let's cast it and get to the model. And that's actually the only change we need to do. An alternative approach here, if we need the model, is to override the type of the scope. So we call super scope and we cast it to person scope. Now we can use scope.model in this way. We didn't even need to have this variable. Actually, we could use the scope directly to get to the model. Whichever way you prefer is just a matter of taste, really. So that takes care of the person editor. And then let's have a look at the list. That's a bit different because we injected this controller, and we're not going to do that anymore, so we're just going to remove it. But here we're going to need the list of persons and the model, so the best approach here would be to override the scope variable. So let's see. Super scope as person scope. Now we can get to scope.persons and scope.model. Now back in the main view, we have to look at the menu item that was supposed to open a new window. So now instead of just creating a new scope, we will of course create a person scope. And that's what's going to make sure that these two objects will have access to the person scope we create here. Now we have a bit of a special situation because this is the main view of the application, and when we initialize it, the default scope is not going to be a person scope. It's going to be just the default scope. So the cast would fail for this if we run the application now. This is not going to work. So we have different ways of solving that. First one is a bit weird, since you probably don't want to have the application scope set to a person scope, but I'm just going to show it to you anyway. So in the app constructor, we can actually set the scope of the application. And since we set the scope of the application, once the application looks up the main view will get this scope that we declare here. And then everything's going to work. You know, there's going to be a person scope available for these two, and we're going to create a new person scope in here. So let's run that first. We should now get a separate scope for each window we open. And that works. You see, we have separate scopes. Now, as I mentioned, what we did here is a bit weird. So there is one other option, and that is to say in the main view that we override scope as well. And we say that scope is if superscope is a person scope, we'll use that. If not, we'll create a new person scope. So this means that since it will fail for the first instance of our main view, we will get this person scope. For the next one, which is looked up using this construct, this would match and we would get the scope we injected. This all is a bit weird because it's the main view we're working on. That would normally not be the case, I guess. So, but anyway, I think the point gets across anyway. So now we have removed the default scope from the application, and we made sure that we always get a person scope in the main view, no matter what scope was passed to us when we were created. And if it was passed a person scope, we'll keep it. If not, we'll create a new person scope. This scope will then be transferred to whatever object we create here. So let's try it again. It seems it worked okay. We still have the same functionality as we had earlier. So even though this example is a bit contrived, I think the point here remains. So just to recap, what we did now is create a custom scope that is also the view state for us. So we don't need to inject any model, and we don't need a separate controller to keep track of the person list. So hopefully this will be a helper for MDI applications as well. And that's it really. Bye bye.